Hey, yeah, thanks everybody. Am I actually mic'd up? It sounds like I am. Sweet. Yeah, so originally the name of the talk was going to be reactquery from 0 to hero, but I've dropped down the difficulty level to intermediate just as a sign of Murphy's law of text presentations, that what can go wrong will go wrong eventually in the presentation. So that's something we're going to live with. However, I do expect this to be a good opening act for the following talk. By way of introduction, though, like I said, I'd show you the websites for where I work. So Collectors Universe, we are a holding company of some of the biggest brands in the collectibles space. If anybody has collected cards and had them graded by a company called PSA, they're one of ours. And the one that I work for is called Golden Auctions. And we are an auction marketplace for collectibles of all sorts. The current auction that we have right now is a sports-related auction, but we do comics and video games and all sorts of really cool stuff. And the admin tools that I work on are what power these. Now, the difference between Golden and, say, eBay is that we have teams of consignment managers and people who interact with sellers of different collectibles, and we actually bring together thousands of items and we put them into one auction. And so along with that comes a lot of sort of managerial stuff, administrative stuff that they have to do to make sure that each item has the right pictures to it. Each item has the correct name, it has the right price, all that kind of stuff, bidding on items, the whole shebang. Now, it's good practice to not recreate exactly what you do for a living in one of these presentations. So I had to choose some sort of different subject matter to work on, which I'll get to. But let me introduce just the idea here of reactquery. And so I think their intro paragraph is pretty good for this. It's the missing data fetching library for React. It makes fetching, caching, synchronizing, and updating server state in React applications a breeze. And so in this presentation, I'm going to show some of the more legacy methods that I've seen for handling server state in a React application. And then, by contrast, I'm going to show you how to add reactquery to a project, and then how to at least use the caching layer and try to synchronize some of the caches. The more heroic part that I would have tried to get to is also performing mutations. In other words, when I send a push out to the server, send a post or a put or one of those kinds of requests, what does it do with the data? What is my application state during the process? Am I loading? Have I succeeded? Have I failed? What do I do in those cases as well? I can show you kind of the gist of it, but like I said, Murphy's law with these apps that you're building, the last part of it didn't come out entirely the way I would hope to. But an introduction to the actual app. Probably one of the most fun things about building this app was playing with AI. So completely off topic for reactquery, but I had to build something, and it had to be of some sort of complexity above a to-do list. If it was just some easy back and forth kind of thing with a little bit of data, I don't think the performance aspect of it would have mattered. And to me, one of the key things about reactquery is how do I handle slow network requests? How do I handle things with a lot of data? How do I handle kind of real-world situations where I need to reconcile data that's maybe I've got a large set of things, but I also want to work with the individual. And do I want to make that request every single time? And how do I keep those consistent? So I guess conceptually, just credits. If anyone has not read this book, I strongly recommend it. If you have read this book, you'll probably have a good clue about my take on social media. And this is the sort of hot new social media app. The logo comes from DALL-E 2, which is an art generator running from OpenAI. All of the text, which is ample, comments, posts, all that kind of stuff, comes from the OpenAI DaVinci engine, and then the profile pictures come from the random user generator .me. So it's amazing the kind of stuff that you can create that is not at all real and puts you kind of in this weird uncanny valley of social media, which is my favorite place to be. So here's our logo. God only knows how the AI thought this was going to be pronounced, but I'm digging it. It's very startup-y. I asked them for a startup logo. And the actual app I was trying to build was called Flutter. So this is what AI does with Flutter, is they call it this when they're making art. So whatever, but Flutter's the name lifted out of the book. And what it was supposed to be is kind of like a social media app where the users are in control, to the extent that like if I want to show up in your feed, I can pay extra to show up in your feed. If I want to remove a comment that I made that I regret, I can remove it for a fee. For an extra fee, you can see that I didn't even pay to have it removed. So there's all these extra levels of things that you can do. Now, of course, in the span of just a few days of like actually making this thing, I wasn't able to get that far. But I'll unveil the app, and then I'll show you sort of the code behind it. So here's our app. Here's our hot new app. It's taken from all of the best users on Facebook, which happened to be Zuck and a bunch of old people. It was the kind of least like crazy thing that I could find that would impersonate Facebook through AI. And our original version of this has spinners everywhere. It takes forever to get done in this app. I want to see my followers, I got spinners. I want to see my posts, I got spinners. I want to see my profile. Hey, look at that, I got more spinners, I go back home, look at all those spinners. This is wonderful. This is sort of legacy handling of network state in its best. So I'll take you on a little journey through how this works. Starting with, let's look at our home page, right? This is one of the patterns that's like shortest, most brief legacy way of handling async state, which is, on my page load, I'm going to fire off a use effect. That use effect is going to get all of my posts for me. It's going to get all my users for me. Bear in mind that I wrote this app to be as bad as possible. So there's going to be areas that are unclean just because, I was rushing. There's going to be areas that are also done intentionally to be slow. In fact, actually on my server, if we look at some of these controllers, let's see, I've literally added additional timeouts just to slow down my requests. Because this thing needs to be slow. This thing really needs a caching solution. Now, every time home renders, that use effect is going to happen. And it's going to call for my posts again. It's going to call for my users again. So every time we need to see that, we need to see some spinners. But I have all these other components on my page that also need to do something, right? So I have an avatar menu that I can use to switch who my users are, and every time I switch my user, of course, it has to load again. And then all of my following and my followers, they have to load up again. And so it's kind of a mess here. And in addition to that, there's no real reuse of code that's going on. I mean, I could have abstracted this out to a hook of its own. But in general, we end up seeing a lot of the same thing, just kind of copy pasta from one page to another. And in addition to that, I'm keeping state on my components that I have to keep track of that all the time too. So my individual user in this case and my loading state in this case are both things that I would have gotten for free from reactquery. So to sort of conceptualize reactquery, it's going to have a provider that's up wrapping the top level of my app. And every time I make a request that's in the reactquery format, it's going to put that request over here in a cache that's, again, at the top level of my app. And it's going to keep certain information for me. Load state, for instance. Am I idle, loading, success, error? What is the most recent result? What is my data that I have from that request? And it has sort of a hashing pattern that it follows to say, if I see a request and I see this hash of this request here, just give me that data back. Don't even bother going back to that slow API. Just give me that back. And along with that, it has a lot of really handy tools for invalidating that cache so that I'm not working with stale data all the time. And as well as that, also ways that I can imperatively refetch data so that I know that things are going to be different. I know that something has changed. Let's make sure that we go out to the actual network layer and bring it back. So we have this as one example of a legacy pattern for state management. And I didn't get so far as to actually implement this with Redux, but Redux is kind of the common alternative that you might see. And in recent memory, since the last time I had to use Redux for state management, for network state management, I should say, they came out with Redux Toolkit. And so Redux Toolkit has a whole new set of opinions and paradigms for how to create all of the same state that I would want to make for a network request. And if you look at all of this boilerplate, it's not all that different to me than what I originally saw in Redux, which was kind of the chief problem with using Redux in the first place for handling this stuff. It's just like so many things that you have to write over and over and over again just to get a network request to go out there and to manage that state. And so if we're looking at either this really complicated paradigm or copy pasta all over the place, you might end up with just the copy pasta and not really share any code at all. And likewise, they don't reach out to the same store for data. Each of these components that's doing this, on a per component level has to make all of those network requests every single time it renders, and that kind of sucks. So by contrast, let's move over to my reactquery branch, and let me just highlight here that every time I reload, obviously, I am going to be expecting to see more spinners all over my page, right? And the advantage that we're going to get from reactquery is that those spinners go away. Now, one of the Murphy's Law things about when I was building this presentation is that the performance still kind of sucked when I moved it to reactquery, but at least you didn't see spinners. So that'll be the moral of that story. And we'll move to the reactquery branch. So I'll show you the query client provider is going to go at the top of my app. It's actually at the index level of this app. So I've wrapped my entire app with the query client provider coming from reactquery. Now it's kind of like an offshoot of TanStack. And I actually have my Redux provider here as well. And so this kind of enforces to me that I have access to this query client everywhere in my app. And what I've done is to actually separate my queries out into a set of discrete queries per use case. So for instance, use posts. And I'll focus first just on the really basic part of how this works, which is the use query hook from reactquery. It takes an array of various things, usually strings. In this case, I use an enum. And if I want to make it more specific, I'll use an enum plus maybe a string. So for instance, get posts by user might take that. Enum for get post by user. It'll take the slug as well. And this is going to be going into my hashing function such that every time use posts by user invoked with whatever slug is going to take that user from that place in the cache, and it's going to give me that data. Now, all the other stuff in the middle here, I'm going to kind of gloss over it just a little bit because these are more advanced things that I did inside of it to try and reconcile these caches. I'll give you sort of the quick overview but not dive too deep into it. So reactquery gives me access to my query client. So from within any of my query hooks, I can call other hooks, including use query client. And when I use query client, I have access to a whole lot of the internals of reactquery, including one that's called set data or something like that, set query data. And what set query data is doing for me is it's taking one of those query keys, which, if I know the query key for get users, then I know where I want to update. If I know the slug for a user, then I can update get user with that particular slug. So sort of the advanced part here is taking all of my posts as they come in, and what I want to do is pre-populate my cache. Because I know all of those posts are going to be there, but they need to be divvied out by posts by user, and they need to be divvied out by individual post as well. So when I have, say, one post, and it wants to know only who am I as a post, it can reach out into that cache without having to incur that 1 second timeout that I put on the back end or anything like that. So I'm doing a for each here, and I'm setting that based on each post in the array. This is probably one of the things that kind of screwed my performance up when I was doing it earlier, so we'll bear with that. But when I move over to the app on the React query version, I start off with the same spinners as I was having before, and then I get a wonderful white screen of death. I don't know why I got it that time around. Maybe it was from switching branches. But as I go from one profile to the next, notice how these followers are not flashing spinners anymore. I can change my user, and I don't have to see everything reloading. I can, let's go deep down, find somebody new that I haven't seen before. Not that I would remember any of these names, they're all AI generated. But since all of this stuff is loaded up for me, I don't have to reload that again. And I think you could tell just from seeing the original spinners, it saves a massive amount of time here. Inside of one of my components, when I want to use this data, I now have some things that come to me for free that are very easy to me to reason about and to work with. So I have use posts, and I've got use users. I tend to alias this. I'm sure there's probably a better practice for it deep within reactquery. And if you'll notice in the, this is actually v3 version of the docs, but there's a ton of stuff that this does. If I was to really claim real heroicness over reactquery, it would probably take me a lifetime to figure out all the cool stuff that it can do. But I promise you that it is there, and it's done quite well. But anyway, I've got my data, and I've got my status. And so status is going to be, and that goes, I think, off the side of the screen. Oh, maybe v4 lost the idle state. So I've got error, success, loading as my possible states, and I have a loading wrapper component. And this is a component that I've made myself, and it does a few things for me. One is if I have multiple queries going on, and I'm feeding it an array of these statuses, if any of them is loading, I'm going to show a spinner. Likewise, if I have an error, I can show an error message. And then finally, I can show my children if it actually succeeds. All that comes, again, like I said, for free. So I don't have to keep track of who's loading. I don't have to keep track of, if I have 2 queries, 3 queries, multiple queries on a page that are going at one time. They don't each have to have their own load state for me to say, is this component actually ready to go? And along with that, it gives me a little bit more safety that I know 2 things, right? I know that my thing has stopped loaded. I also know that if that status has changed from loading to success, then by inference, I have some kind of data there. So I can assume that that data is there and it's sort of type safe. And that allows for way fewer bugs in the code. Now, as far as mutations go, I'll give you just sort of the signature and then wrap it up and hand it off to the next person. But rather than, let's see, followers list, one of these has a button for adding a follower. We'll do likes. That's my like list. It's on post. Sorry. It's amazing how quickly these things can get big. All right, be the first to like this. There's a button, and we see on click, wants to send a like. Now, I do like how this is very terse and clean, but there are things that I can do better with it. And so one of these is the reactquery use mutation hook. And I'll show you the signature, and then I'll explain what it does without showing you and letting my app crash. Gives me back a function called mutate. Usually what I do is I'll alias it as do whatever, so like do send like. And then the other freebie that I really like here is, again, that status key. It tells me what is the, how's my request doing? So that would be like send like status. And that's going to be a equals use mutation. And it takes a couple things. Take some mutation key. I'm just going to take a mutation function. And that function doesn't need the async part of it. Or the await. And the part that I find exciting here is that this doSendLike function has some extra goodies here that, again, give me freebies for state. So when I want to actually handle sending my like, in this case, I don't need to send it any params based on the way I've defined my mutation function. But the cool stuff is after here. I got settled. I got on success. There's an on error. I'll just show you on success. It's a callback that gets fired when the call actually resolves. And from there, I can take, say, whatever data came back, and maybe I would use that to update my cache. Or I can use it to show a message, So it might be like show success toast, like successfully liked. I'm not going to type it very well right now. But I can have all these things that happen, again, for free. And it's so much easier to write than literally anything else that I've seen. Now, what I will say is that, writing this actual app and the actual back end of it and keeping that stuff in sync was kind of a pain. I probably would have had a lot more time to do this with proper mutations and all of that kind of stuff if I had used what our next speaker is talking about, but I had never heard of it until today. So I'm very excited to hear from you, and I'll wrap mine up. Thank you, everybody.